From the Toronto Star, I'm Raju Mudhar, and this matters. Dundas, Vaughan, Ryerson. All three are names of important things in the GTA, but all their namesakes are problematic. And they certainly are not the only ones. With the civil unrest inspired by the death of George Floyd, many of the protests have vandalized, targeted, and brought down statues of historical figures that are reminders of our colonial and anti-Black past. For a long time, this debate has mostly centered on Confederate statues in the US, but has now found renewed interest worldwide and has come to our streets and towns. Today, Vaughan City Council is looking at this issue behind their namesake, while Toronto City Council has already struck a working group to look at renaming Dundas Street. That thoroughfare is named for Henry Dundas, a Scottish politician who never set foot in this country and had a role in extending slavery. To discuss the broader historical context of naming and renaming things, we'll be joined by Melanie Newton, an associate professor of history at the University of Toronto. But our first guest is Andrew Lougheed, who works as an arts administrator and is a multidisciplinary artist in Toronto. He started the petition to rename Dundas Street that has spurred City Council to act. He joins us today to talk about why. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Raju. Thank you so much for having me on. It's great to be a part of the show today.
Andrew, let's just start at the beginning here. You started this, I believe, last week. I think we're almost at 10,000 signatures. Why did you start this petition?
Slightly over 10,000 signatures at this point. The real inspiration behind the petition was a similar movement happening in Edinburgh, Scotland. Controversy around the Melville Monument, a 42-meter column in the center of Edinburgh that atop it rests the statue of Henry Dundas, 1st Viscount Melville. And the controversy around that, I was interested in learning about. I knew that Viscount Melville was the Dundas for whom Dundas Street here in Toronto was named. I thought if they're having a discussion about replacing that statue, and at the very least recontextualizing it, that it was probably a worthwhile conversation for us to be having here.
Andrew, I completely agree because I'm going to show my ignorance. I live right next to Dundas Street. My kid goes to Dundas Junior Public School, and I was not aware of any of this man's history. Can you tell us a little bit about Henry Dundas, please?
Henry Dundas, as I mentioned, 1st Viscount Melville, was the British Secretary of War and State in the late 1790s and early 1800s. In this capacity, as a parliamentarian for Midlothian, he actively campaigned against the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. What's more, Melville's largest obstruction in this process was the insistence upon the word gradually being inserted into any piece of abolition legislation. As a direct result of this, over 630,000 people remained in bondage for an additional 15 years, which is very significant to think about considering the average life expectancy of a slave at that time may have been just 22 years. So a significant contribution to the deaths of tens of thousands of people and the continued enslavement of hundreds of thousands of others. It's a really telling parable about the power of words, and I think a perfect illustration of why we need to change this street name.
Have you looked into what goes into changing a street? Do you know what the process is? And obviously, I think your plan is to get as many signatures as possible and then take this to City Council. I know that they've done it with Peter Street or one of the Peter Streets because that also has some issues with it. But what do you know about the process moving forward?
Moving forward is, I'm really looking forward to next steps on this. At present, the current announcement is that Mayor John Tory has ordered the city manager to strike a committee to further explore street names and monuments in Toronto. What I am interested in at this point is kind of ensuring that this process becomes a truly community-engaged and collaborative process involving, in particular, that it's a process led by Black and Indigenous organizations and historical societies, as well as other community stakeholders who represent the diversity of the city of Toronto. I'm very happy to have raised the conversation. I'm interested to see how it moves forward now. As far as the mechanics of how a street gets renamed, the official mechanic of it is that 75% of property owners along the street must vote to change the name. I'm not sure that this is a process that might look differently, given the seriousness of it and the urgency with which it's required to be addressed. So we'll be looking forward. I'm looking and have reached out to all of Toronto's city councillors to kind of get advice on next steps and how to move this forward.
It's very early days. Obviously, you're seeing a lot of support. Have you heard any opposition yet?
Well, I think with anything like this, you're bound to get the haters, as it were. But overall, the response has been really positive. Negative responses tend to fall into a number of logical fallacy categories. One, the concern that people are erasing or rewriting history. I think this really comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of what history actually is. When we tend to think of history in a popular sense, we think of it as immutable fact, unchangeable date. And really what history is it's a present day evaluation of the past. Rewriting history and reevaluating the past is the very process of history. What's important to remember in that process is no one is erasing any history. Rather, we're illuminating a history that's there already. So other objections fall under the, I didn't know who Dundas was, so why does this matter to me? On a very kind of base level too, it's also that if you don't know who this person is, and street names are supposed to be, an honorific that someone is granted for doing something exceptional, if that's not resonating with you, in a way, it's also not doing its job. So that should be reason alone to consider changing the name.
Now, I don't want to, this is one of those things, I'm worried about my ignorance of histories here, but just doing some quick research. The Viscount Melville never visited here. Is that correct?
Yeah. This is another great reason that we don't need something named Dundas here. There are over 600 places, I believe, in Canada named after Viscount Melville, Henry Dundas, a man who visited here a total of 0 times. Beyond his obstructions to the ending of slavery in the Empire, has very little impact on Canada itself or the country that would become Canada. Obviously, the slavery piece is a massive impact, but at the same time, it's not like, oh, but he did other good things for us that we should consider. It's literally nothing. The reason this exists is largely due to the kind of Byzantine power and patronage systems of Georgian politics in the late 18th century. He was friends with Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe. He got a road named after him, and a town, and some other features, and a road in another town, and so on and so forth. So I think another argument to be made is that we should try and find, again, someone meaningful to us to name this street after.
Andrew, I think the other argument that people are going to have is, if you start this, when do you stop? Ryerson is another controversial name. The city of Vaughan, also supposedly another controversial history to that name. Dundas, obviously there's schools, there's streets, you said 600 places, there's a neighborhood, Dundas West. How do you counter that argument?
Well, it is, on its very surface, the textbook definition of a slippery slope fallacy. In a number of interviews that I've had the pleasure to listen to today, to listen to Black Canadian historians speak about this and other historians and academics, a lot to be considered here is the weight of action. While other people may have been slave owners, and that's wrong, we also might want to consider that Dundas is so important to this because he is the single individual for whom all those possibilities are rendered. So the very system that other people perpetuated, he solely upheld. He wielded absolute power, massive power within the Regency governments, particularly in that of William Pitt the Younger. You don't get the nickname the Great Tyrant as a term of endearment, do you? So he's someone with absolutely unimaginable power in the British Empire. At the same time, while we need to consider carefully these choices, also, I'm here for the renaming. If people deem others no longer fit of a public remembrance or honor, I'm happy to support that. I think it's a good process. It's a natural process to be reevaluating what it is. It's the very meaning of history, to reevaluate and write narratives anew constantly. So that's very important.
Andrew, I think this is fantastic for us. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you think our listeners should know?
Just that I hope everyone signs the petition, that we can really begin in earnest a conversation about renaming these public monuments and taking steps towards educating ourselves about who the people we memorialize and whose systems of power we perpetuate. This is extremely important to me. I want to be very clear that in this process of starting the petition and what it is I'm calling for, it's been an amazing thing that a committee has been ordered by the mayor, and I'm happy to see some direct and immediate action taken towards that end. But I really firmly believe that coming up with suggestions or a long list or a process towards reevaluation needs to be a process led by Black-led organizations, historical societies, Indigenous groups, and other communities who represent, as I say, the diverse nature of the city of Toronto.
Andrew, I want to thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, yeah.
Andrew Lougheed started a petition to rename Dundas Street in Toronto. Next, we have Melanie Newton. She's an associate professor of history at the University of Toronto and specializes in the history of the Caribbean and the Atlantic world. We asked her here to provide a little bit of historical context about this issue. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
So first, Professor Newton, I think for a lot of people, this is considered much more of an American issue and particularly based around Confederate statues. Why is this an issue here? And why should people care about changing the street's name?
So it's an issue here because the same kinds of historical forces that created the United States, that created the underlying issues that led to the Civil War, which were about the northern expansion of slavery and the westward expansion of the continental United States. All of those same histories have shaped Canada. There is a myth here that slavery is not relevant to Canada, which is not true. Canada did have a domestic system of Black and Indigenous enslavement. It profited from the system of slavery in the United States. It was part of the Atlantic world economy, which was based on both the conquest of the Americas and the trade in Africans. So it is absolutely embedded in those same kinds of historical and social and racially unequal structures. So you see the same kinds of issues reflected in the landscape. Here, in terms of the histories of urban planning, what has been celebrated in terms of street names and monuments are figures who were central conquest and in colonization and in slavery and systems of imperial domination.
I think one of the lines that a lot of people are familiar with, or there should be, is that history is written by the victors. Can you tell us how the street's name might be an example of that? And also, I think the next part of that is, what do you think about the worldwide interest in at least talking about making changes to this?
So to take the first question, absolutely history is written by the victors. And I think the place where it's written by the victors is precisely in the systems of urban development and municipal development. Again, street names. What do we name our streets? What kinds of monuments do we put up? Who gets consulted about those monuments? What kinds of values do they reflect? So the 19th century, which is the really kind of crucial period in the consolidation of a system of white settler power in Canada, this is also the high point of urban, in a sense, redevelopment. A lot of our street names, not just in Canada, but in the US, across many parts of Europe, a lot of the street names that we take for granted now, they date from that period, including the name Henry Dundas. And what those were about in that moment was precisely about embedding in the landscape, in everyday life, in the streets, in the names of buildings, everywhere, the fact of white supremacy, basically. So that's why it matters, right? That's why it's so important, because we are living, actually, literally living in landscapes that were created to celebrate that form of power. Now, over the course of the 20th century, we have come, in some ways, not necessarily in all the structural ways that matter, to question whether or not that is a legitimate system of power. And the general consensus is that it is not a legitimate system of power. And yet, again, most of our public forms of commemoration, which are created in that period, still celebrate that history. So the sort of monument making has not kept up with the public conversations about what actually constitutes a legitimate form of government and a legitimate basis for power and legitimate systems of democratic rule. Now, in terms of what I think about the wider conversation, I think that, first of all, I mean, here, people know a lot about, obviously, the situation with George Floyd and the recent instances of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous police brutality that have been in the news in Canada lately, particularly in Toronto, New Brunswick, and in Alberta. But there was a much earlier movement around this in recent years, which was in South Africa. It was the Roads Must Fall movement. And the Roads Must Fall movement really sort of targeted monuments to Cecil Rhodes, who was a crucial figure in the conquest and establishment of white minority rule in South Africa and in the longer history of the establishment of apartheid in South Africa. So this is a part of a global recognition that these monuments are not just innocuous. They're not doing nothing. They sort of reassure those in power that, yes, society changes. Yes, when we look at who has the vote in most of these societies around the Atlantic world now, you know, the voting population has changed, policies have changed. But ultimately, in all the ways that sort of literally in the land beneath our feet, what is celebrated is the structures and hierarchies of power that were established in the past that continue to shape who has power and privilege in the present, that those are not going to be fundamentally disrupted by social change. So they actually reassure the powerful of their power and their privilege.
What about the arguments against changing them? I'm going to list three. One, that perhaps the street name is now in its own way a part of history, that they serve as potentially an educational tool for people. And
well, that's my favorite.
I'm teeing you up, ma'am, I know. And then, of course, the third one, though, is the idea that changing things is going to be confusing, and when does it end?
Let's deal with the first one, that they are part of history. Things change all the time. These street names are also not part of history. As I just made the point earlier, they're actually part of our present. The reason they make people so angry is precisely because they trigger the realization of how much they reflect not just the past, but the present. How is it that we can all live in a society rooted in British colonialism, where we have come to critique or claim to acknowledge, for example, the wrongness of Indigenous genocide, the wrongness of conquest, that these things are wrong and that we have to redress them. We can't undo the past, right? And that's an important thing to acknowledge. No one is saying that we can go back and undo the past. But it is precisely the fact that, particularly if you are a racialized person, particularly if you are Black or Indigenous in this hemisphere, what is being celebrated is the continued colonization and conquest of your present. There is a close relationship between the ongoing presence of these kinds of street names and that ongoing reality in which the state, on the one hand, acknowledges the problematic history of conquest, but then on the other hand continues to celebrate these kinds of people. And then an education system that doesn't teach people who these individuals were, doesn't teach people to really be critical and thoughtful about this history or to reflect on their place in it, and therefore does not educate the white majority in this hemisphere about their relationship to structures of racism and their role in perpetuating it. So that this is then a history that Black and Indigenous people have to carry in the form of systemic discrimination at work, being more exposed to police brutality and violence, being more exposed to the likelihood of poverty, all of those things, right? These kinds of monuments and street names legitimate a system in which in this context, white majority of the population does not have to think about these things. But I think it is interesting that once this debate came to the surface, what you have seen is, yes, some reflection, but a lot of hostility. One of the things about power is most powerful in some senses when it claims to be invisible, when it's there, so taken for granted that it's not talked about. And I think now that we're having this conversation, for a lot of people that is unsettling because it forces people to have conversations and to reflect in ways that actually they're educated not to have to do. So that idea that they're part of history, that is not true. They are very much part of the present as much as they're part of the past. They represent that ongoing way in which history for human beings is a relationship between the past and the present. Now, your second point, they're useful for teaching. They're not an educational tool. Look, I work at the University of Toronto. This country spends a lot of money educating its academics, puts a lot of money into its school system, and it's not clear to me why we would need these monuments to do that job for us. I would question how often they're actually used as an educational tool to start with versus how often people just walk down these streets without thinking about what they represent. And then I also would say that if you want to educate people about the past, then you need to do it in a much more balanced way. It is one thing to stand in a classroom, whether it's a high school classroom or a university classroom, and teach people about the complexities of history, introduce, more critical assessments of colonialism, introduce historical figures who are not only white and not only men, who are also crucial figures in history. It's one thing to do that in the classroom, but then everywhere else in society, including in the street names, a narrative that actually the people who really matter are these people, the Henry Dundases of the world. That stuff you learn in the classroom is just for the classroom. So that's the message I think it sends. It's like they're not useful for education. They are a tool of miseducation. They're a way of continuing to propagate the values of the 19th century elite in the present. I am not an urban planner, but I am fairly certain that municipal governments have a range of tools at their disposal to bring about these kinds of changes with minimal disruption. So that is the first thing I would say. I think that is an argument that is too complicated and too difficult is a bit of a red herring. I would also say that I think if we think about what it was like to live through conquest, if you were, particularly in the case of much of Canada, an Indigenous person, and to see over the course of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, what people would have lived through was the complete renaming and transformation of their world, right? So that it was now colonial authorities who had the power to name everything. I think that the request to rename a street, in the case of the Henry Dundas issue, in the context of that wider history, is not a huge ask if we are actually serious about, as a society, about really thinking through the legacies of colonialism. And then that question of where it ends. So one of the things about being human is that what makes us human is that uniquely among all animals, we have this need to situate ourselves in place and in time. We need stories about the past to tell us who we are and to shape our relationships with each other in the present. That is part of what it means to be human. So this idea that history is something that is sort of just in the past and we don't constantly revisit it, that just goes against everything about what it actually means to be human and why we need not just stories, but stories that we understand to be not just fiction, but stories about our past. When does it end? It doesn't ever end, right? This myth that we shouldn't have conversations about our past, that we should leave those in the classroom, that is actually a colonial myth, precisely to protect a certain narrative of the past that, again, privileges people in the present.
There feels like there's real momentum on this issue right now. How do you keep it up?
I came to Canada first as a teenager at the time of the Rodney King riots. And I've lived through, over the course of my time here, a number of historical upheavals, Idle No More, a range of really profound questionings of the relationship between structural racism against particularly Black and Indigenous people as the forms of racism that are really sort of foundational to this hemisphere and sort of built into its DNA. I do feel like this is a little bit different. I am mindful of the fact that very often the change happens. It's not always the change that people had imagined or hoped for. I think we saw that with the history of, for example, the civil rights movement in the United States, where you did get legal change and you had a few years of change in terms of socioeconomic realities, but then they stalled as you had the resurgence of this sort of basically a white supremacist narrative in U.S. politics in the late 1960s and 1970s. I think the crucial thing is that people who live these realities have to be in positions of power to make these decisions. There need to be, and this is where the conversation about people, about quote unquote affirmative action, the reason why something like affirmative action is important is because it recognizes precisely that danger of a backlash. So you can have a couple of years where that sort of white supremacist agenda is in retreat. But what it has done historically, going back to the abolition of slavery, is to sort of regroup and resurface using different language but the same tactics. Affirmative action strategies are important to ensure that the presence of people who are themselves the descendants of the survivors of slavery and colonization are in positions of power to shape these decisions. And that has to be protected by legislation. If that doesn't happen, then it will be very hard to sustain because this white supremacist agenda is so powerful across this hemisphere. It's not just in Canada. So I would say that it does take political commitment to withstand that onslaught that will come.
Well, we definitely will be watching. We want to thank you so much for your time today, Professor Newton.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for asking me.
Melanie Newton is an associate professor of history at the University of Toronto. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Raju Mudhar, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etizaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Foso. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.